delighted to welcome so many of you here. I see we have standing room only, so I'm sorry for those of you who we weren't able to accommodate in the seating capacity. I can happily say next year it'll be better at Carleton. We have new lecture rooms being built, but unfortunately you'll just have to make yourselves as comfortable as you can. My name is Eileen Saunders, and I'm the director of the Arthur Kruger College of Public Affairs at Carleton University. And I'm very pleased to welcome you to the second annual Sir John A. Macdonald Lecture in Business and Public Policy. The purpose of this lecture, which was inaugurated last spring, is to invite leading figures from private, public, and not-for-profit sectors to reflect on issues that really are at the intersection of public policy and business, and really to talk about their own contributions in dealing with those issues. This lecture series is generously supported by the Dominion of Canada General Insurance Company, and I would like to invite Vivian Berkovich, who is the Vice President for Legal and Public Affairs at the company, to say a few words on their behalf. Vivian?
Thank you, Eileen, and good afternoon and welcome to everybody, and thanks for coming. I should share with you, it's not a widely known fact, but since this is the Sir John A. Macdonald Lecture Series, the distinction for which he's known where I come from is not so much that he was the first Prime Minister of Canada as much as upon leaving office he founded the Dominion of Canada General Insurance Company. And we're quite proud of that. That's not the only reason that we've chosen to sponsor these lectures. The Dominion of Canada was, in 1887 I believe, and remains a national property and casualty insurance company with national interests, but not just interests of a commercial nature. It's a company with what I consider to be a proud lineage and a very strong tradition of involvement with public policy matters. And there's a very healthy and entrenched corporate culture that encourages involvement in such endeavors and is very, I think, respectful of the synergy between, as Eileen referred to, the intersection of public and private lives and society, government, and commerce. So on behalf of the Dominion of Canada General Insurance Company, there is no short form, and our president, George Cook, I'd like to thank you all for coming today, and not just for the way in which you'll benefit from hearing the esteemed speaker, but also for encouraging us in our continued support of such endeavors. Thanks very much. Enjoy the afternoon.
Thank you, Vivian. It's now my great pleasure to introduce today's speaker. Robert Mundell was born in Canada, educated at the University of British Columbia and the London School of Economics before receiving his PhD from MIT. He joined in 1961 the staff of the International Monetary Fund. From 1966 to 1971, he was professor of economics at the University of Chicago, and during that time was editor of the Journal of Political Economy. In 1974, he went to Columbia University, where he has remained since then as professor of economics. Professor Mundell has lectured widely in North and South America, Europe, Africa, Australia, and Asia. He has been an advisor to a number of international agencies and organizations, including the United Nations, the IMF, the World Bank, the Government of Canada, several governments in Latin America and in Europe, the Federal Reserve Board, and the U.S. Treasury. He is the author of numerous works and articles on economic theory, of international economics. He prepared one of the first plans for a common currency in Europe, and he is known as the father of the theory of optimum currency areas. He was a pioneer of the theory of monetary and fiscal policy mix, the theory of inflation and interest and growth, the monetary approach to the balance of payments, and the co-founder of supply-side economics. He has also written extensively on the history of the international monetary system. He has received honorary degrees and professorships in several universities in North America, Europe, and Asia, and many distinguished awards. In 1999, he received the Nobel Memorial Prize in Economic Science. So it is a great honor today for Carleton University to welcome Professor Mundell and he will speak this afternoon on Is North America an Optimum Currency Area? Professor Mundell.
Well, thank you very much, Eileen. I think I have to push something here. Oh, there we are. And put that up. It's a great pleasure for me to be here and to talk on this subject and to give the lecture, the Sir John A. Macdonald Lecture. Actually, I I have a soft spot in my mind for Sir John A. Macdonald because he was buried not very far from where I was born. He was dead and I was a little kid at the time. I feel a certain empathy for him. He was buried in Cataraqui outside Kingston, was his place, and I grew up in that place there. And of course, he is the first Prime Minister of Canada. Was like a kind of George Washington without the revolution beforehand. And he was prominent because he affected the whole course of Canadian history by his policy of building the CPR and the tariff. And in fact, when the Maritimes, now the Atlantic provinces, joined the Confederation, he created one of the most important trade-diverting customs union that's ever been created. It was, it was a trade-diverting customs union. People who are experts on customs unions talk about trade creation and trade diversion. And why it was trade diverting was that when the Maritimes were the most open and advanced part of Canada, when they joined and the tariff was put on, they lost their export markets because, the symmetry theorem in trade is a tax on imports is a tax on exports. So they lost their export markets, and the basic theory was that they'd divert their exports to the central provinces, the dominant central provinces. But that would only be at a big cost. But to persuade them that it was worthwhile, they were given special concessions in railway rates and subsidies for transportation that overcame that process a little bit. But then those subsidies were eventually taken away, and for 100 years after, if not still today, the Maritime and Atlantic provinces have been victims of that Sir John A.'s policy. Now, out of it, Canada was created and born, became a lusty and advanced country, but it was a very costly endeavor for the Maritime provinces, as it would have been for the wings of Canada away from the central provinces. Well, I didn't come here to talk about Sir John A. Macdonald, and I'm a great admirer. I was recently, in the middle of January, at a conference on energy in Lake Louise, and it was at the CPR Hotel in Lake Louise, a very lovely place. And they had in it some special rooms devoted to not Sir John A., but his wife, who was an avid mountaineer. And after Sir John had died in, I think it was 1891, she went on and came out to Jasper and Lake Louise and climbed mountains. She was quite an interesting lady. And so I felt then, I knew I was coming to Carleton to give the John A. Macdonald Lecture. I thought that there's a certain destiny with us, of me as a little child being born so close to where he was buried, and so on. Now, my lecture is is the North American optimum currency area. But I have to preface that lecture with a little quick talk about the international monetary system. I wonder if I asked how many people here know what an optimum currency area is. I bet not many of you would raise your hands. And when you get down to it, maybe nobody does, maybe even me, who coined the phrase optimum currency areas in my article in 1961, and which was one of the things that the Nobel Committee mentioned when I was awarded the Nobel Prize. But the international monetary system for most of 2,500 years has been based on precious metals, directly or very indirectly, gold and silver. And automatically that means fixed exchange rates, because if countries used gold and silver, if all countries used gold, then currencies became just names for different weights of gold. And exchange rates were the ratios of the gold content of those currencies. For instance, the historic exchange rate between the pound and the dollar was 4.87, which just meant that the gold content of the pound, the sovereign, that coin that was about a quarter of an ounce, a little more of gold, had 4.87 times the gold content of a US dollar, and so on. And that was the way you got fixed exchange rates. There was a problem if there are two metals in the system, because if silver, another very important, most important monetary metal in the 16th, 17th, and 18th centuries, if the ratio of gold to silver changed, the bimetallic ratio changed. But typically, countries had evolved a bimetallic system. So they would fix the price of gold and the price of silver. And that meant the ratio of gold to silver was fixed. And as long as that system worked, then it didn't matter whether a country used gold or silver. And Britain, by the 18th century, started to use gold in the currencies. Other countries, most countries, used silver. But as long as the bimetallic ratio was fixed, there was fixed exchange rates between the British currency and the other currencies. Now, that standard, that system that existed, was very effective. And over long periods of time, the stability of gold was remarkable, legendary. If you took the price of gold at some dates in Elizabethan times in the 16th century, and then compared them to prices in the 19th century, they could be the same, or they could be different. But the fact is that the long-run value of gold was constant for about, gold and silver, constant for about 4 or 5 centuries. But in between, there were dips, and you had long periods of inflation followed by periods of deflation. But because the periods of inflation more or less offset the periods of deflation, there was long-run stability. So that was a good thing for the long run. If you were lucky enough in those days to live for 100 years or 100 years like the Queen Mother, or 120 years like maybe someone who holds the record for this, then you'd be confident that eventually, if you waited long enough, the price level would come back to where it was when you started. So it was a disturbing kind of fluctuation. But anyway, it gave the world a good kind of monetary sense. Well, the bimetallic system the United States adopted bimetallism in 1792 when it set up the dollar. And France, Napoleon recreated the bimetallic system that Louis XVI had created. So you got two important countries. The United States was very unimportant in 1792. France was very important in 1803 when Napoleon put France again back on the bimetallic standard. But as time came on, the United States became more and more important. But those two countries were the pillars of the bimetallic system. Two things happened to break that system down. One was the U.S. Civil War, which meant now the United States had become more important by 1860 than France. But the United States went off gold and silver altogether during the Civil War. And then the Franco-Prussian War, France went off gold and silver. So bimetallism broke up. And the gold and silver countries went their own special ways. That takes us to 1873. And that's when, at that time, people had begun to think that gold was the modern metal. So increasingly countries went on to the gold standard. With the Franco-Prussian War in 1870-71, France had to pay reparations to Germany of $1 billion, $1 billion US dollars, 5 billion francs. And Germany used that to move away from silver and get onto a gold standard. And then Scandinavian countries did the same. And soon there was a big rush onto the gold standard. And of course that created a new demand for gold, made gold scarce, and created that long wave of deflation in the late 19th century that was so important in literature. People thought, if people are studying literature, you can look at these long waves, ups and downs of the price level, and periods of deflation, periods of inflation, periods of deflation. And it's all reflected in the optimism or pessimism in the literature of the English literature of that period and in other ways. But anyway, the deflation was all ended after gold was discovered in South Africa, and then prices started to rise again. And the gold prices, in terms of gold went up. Gold was cheapened a little bit. And then World War I broke out, and that broke down the gold standards. And here, that's when the issue became important of optimum currency areas, because the world monetary system had collapsed with World War I in an important way. The United States, by this time, had become a dominating force in the system. Keynes wrote a book called The Tract on Monetary Reform, 1923, John Maynard Keynes, in which he said, the gold standard is already a barbarous relic. What he meant for that was not that he wasn't a chrysophobe by any means, but he meant by that the gold standard wasn't working the way it used to work. And it wasn't working because of the United States. He didn't say the United States, but he said a few central banks, but it was the United States. The United States in 1914 was already 3 times as big as the British economy. It was bigger than the French, the British, German, and French economies put together. And after the war, it was 5 times as big as the next biggest economy, because the United States power had increased during the war. So the United States became the superpower of the system and the super economy, and started to eclipse gold in the system. The analogy I like to use is a planetary system analogy. You start off with our solar system. The sun is the center of that solar system. and the sun represents gold. And the other countries tie their currencies, and their orbits are related to the overwhelming mass of the sun, which dominates. But suppose then one of the planets, Jupiter, starts to grow and gets bigger and bigger and bigger. The biggest planet gets bigger and bigger, and eventually it becomes bigger than the sun itself. Well, eventually the planets are going to shift away from circulating around the sun, and the sun itself will start to circulate around Jupiter. It'll become a satellite. That's what happened to gold, because suddenly by 1920, in the 1920s, it was no longer the idea that countries could get onto a gold standard and become stable by that gold standard. It was more rather that gold was tied to the dollar, and the dollar became the important thing. By the 1930s, after they went back to gold, and it broke up. In the 1930s, there was deflation, the Great Depression of that period. But after the United States set the price of gold at $5 an ounce in 1934, then the other countries were off gold, and they fixed their currencies to the dollar. So World War II came, and then during World War II, it was needed to set up a new international monetary system, or to make provisions for the international monetary system in the post-war world. And as a result, countries fixed their currencies to the US dollar, which was the only currency tied to gold. Okay, now I have a little intermission for a moment, because yesterday I had almost completely lost my voice, and I've just acquired it back, but I'm going to lose it again unless I have a little bit of water to keep it going. So the post-war system was based on the dollar standard, but the dollar was fixing the price of gold. But now, in the post-war world, the World War II inflation and post-war inflation had put up doubled prices, tripled prices by the 1950s. And Korean War inflation also. Prices had tripled by the 1950s. And that price of gold set in 1934 was starting to get obsolete. And gold became undervalued and scarce. And the whole problems of the period of the 1950s and 60s was the problem that gold had become undervalued. The natural thing would have been, and there was a provision for this in the IMF Charter, to have a universal change in the par value of gold. Just raise the price of gold to $35 to $70 or better $100 an ounce, something like that. But the United States didn't want to do that because, first of all, there was the problem of the two big gold producers of the world were South Africa and the Soviet Union. And South Africa had this system of apartheid, not very popular anywhere. And the Soviet Union was the enemy in the Cold War. So if they tripled the price of gold, it would improve the terms of trade of those countries. So that was ruled out, and there was no real way to reform the system. They tried to create an SDR, a new kind of money, and genuine international money, but that didn't work. And in 1971, when Britain and a couple of other countries came and asked the United States to convert some of their dollars into gold, the United States said no, and President Nixon took the dollar off gold. So we moved into a world of flexible exchange rates. And that raises the question of what does a system of flexible exchange rates mean? First of all, it's not exactly a system because it's a non-system. It's the absence of a system. A fixed exchange rate system with or without gold is a system. It's with clear rules of its intervention. But flexible exchange rates is just the absence of that system. Moving from fixed to flexible exchange rates is like moving from a government, which you don't like maybe, to no government. So and yet nevertheless, the charter, the IMF charter, was changed to have this Second Amendment and to the Articles of Agreement of the IMF, and that said that the new system was managed flexible exchange rates. Now, I get mad every time I hear the fund, the IMF, praising a country for moving on to flexible exchange rates, because flexible exchange rates is not a system and it's not an anchor of any kind. Flexible exchange rates are consistent with hyperinflation. Germany had flexible exchange rates during the great hyperinflation of the 1920s. So did every country that ever had hyperinflation. A fixed exchange rate, on the other hand, is a monetary rule. And if a country fixes the exchange rate, it gets the the inflation rate of the country it's fixing to. If Mexico fixed the Mexican peso to the US dollar, Mexico would get more or less the inflation rate of the United States. Provided, of course, it has to keep balance of payments in equilibrium, but that's automatic if they just allow the monetary effects of the reserve flows to work itself out. In fact, Mexico did have fixed exchange rates with the dollar for almost 25 years, from 22 years, 1954 until 1976. And except in the last couple of those years, they got the inflation rate of the United States. Panama is a country, a little country. Its national currency is the Balboa, the discoverer of the Pacific, beheaded in 1519. The Balboa, but that's only a coin, because in 1904, when the United States made the agreement for this revolution that created Panama out of Colombia, the new government signed a treaty with the United States saying they would not create a paper currency. And of course, now they have, and they never did. So they used the US dollar. It was a dollarized country. Well, Panama, since 1904, has got has had more or less the inflation rate of the United States. And it's been the most stable country in the Western Hemisphere, apart from the United States, because it's had the dollar as its currency. A lot of other countries look around and see that too. Recently, Ecuador was having a terrible time with its monetary and fiscal policies, great confusion tied to it, but in the past 2 years, it adopted the US dollar. It dollarized, and it now doesn't have the sucre anymore. The sucre means sugar, but it was named after General Sucre, one of the liberators of Ecuador, national hero. But they gave that up, and they now use the US dollar. And eventually, when that equilibrium gets settled, they'll get the inflation rate of the United States from it. Now, where do we come to in flexible exchange rates in the current world? We see we're in a world, there's no international monetary system. And flexible exchange rates is not an international monetary system. It's the absence of a fixed exchange rate monetary system. Now, when I said I get angry when I hear the IMF praising countries for moving on to flexible exchange rates, it's because they're moving away from a monetary rule, which is fixed exchange rates, to giving up that monetary rule. What they should be saying, praising a country for, if a fixed exchange rate monetary rule doesn't work, they should be saying that they praise them for moving on to inflation targeting or monetary targeting, another kind of monetary rule. That makes sense. By and large, when leaving aside gold, which is not so relevant to current discussions, there are three types of monetary rule that a country can follow if it wants stability, meaning by that an inflation rate that's acceptable. One possibility is fix the exchange rate to a major currency, a dominant currency, a big currency that is stable. And then you'll eventually get the inflation rate of that. Just as inside Canada, British Columbia and the Atlantic provinces and Ontario and Quebec and the Yukon all have more or less the same inflation rate, more or less the same, because they're part of a fixed exchange rate zone, of which a common currency is an example. So that's one approach. The second approach is saying, well, forget fixed exchange rates because maybe you can't find an anchor currency. Maybe they should have inflation targeting system. Do what the United States does. The United States doesn't fix the exchange rate. The United States couldn't fix its exchange rate. It couldn't fix the Canadian dollar because the American economy is 11 times as big as the Canadian economy. Couldn't fix the Mexican peso because the United States economy is 25 times bigger than the Mexican economy. You couldn't get stability by that. So there's no alternative for the United States but to have inflation targeting. Now, that's not exactly a completely correct term because it's not exactly inflation targeting because current monetary policy doesn't determine the current inflation rate. There's always a lag in the effect of monetary policy. So current monetary policy affects the inflation rate in 3 months or 6 months or sometime in the future. And the current inflation rate is determined by past monetary policies. So it's really not inflation targeting, it's inflation forecast targeting. When the Bank of Canada decides to expand or contract, they're making forecasts of what their policies today are going to have at some date in the future. We don't know what time period they use. Nobody really knows how long that lag is, but there is that lag. So they have to formulate a view about future inflation. When the United States makes its monetary policy, it has to forecast inflationary dangers. They see the current inflation rate. It's maybe 2.5%. Is it threatening to go up? That's above our limit. We really want 2% inflation. It's 2.5. Should we tighten now, looking at the current inflation rate, or should we forecast the inflation rate 6 months from now? And if we think it's going to go down, we wouldn't need to tighten because it's going to go down anyway. But so it's not rocket science. And that's why in the United States, in the open market committee which makes policy, there are usually big differences of opinion on whether they should expand or contract. And at the margin, votes take place. But of course, in the United States, the prestige of Alan Greenspan is so high that he has like several votes in that committee. And so he has a dominating voice in it. Not because they couldn't vote against him, but because they respect him enough so that they don't vote against him. But you have that inflation targeting, and that's the question there. Well then, where does that leave us in the current picture of optimum currency areas? Well, the word optimum currency areas, as I say, was coined for that article in 1961. And if you read that article, in the first paragraph of that article, it says that this article, its purpose, or its conclusion, was to caution against the effectiveness or usefulness of a system of national currencies connected by flexible exchange rates. So it was really a warning about flexible exchange rates, that flexible exchange rates might not work. Now, why could that be the case? In this article, what I did was to take as the model North America. Surprise. I was writing this in British Columbia in 1957. I was thinking about it and gave it a seminar in 1957. Suppose that something which is a little bit close to reality, suppose North America is divided into two economic regions, the West and the East. And the West produces lumber, and the East produces things like automobiles, manufactures. But then you have a political division of the continent into two parts, Canada and the United States, mostly around the 49th parallel. How does that help adjustment? Well, because the economic regions don't coincide with the political regions, it doesn't help at all. Suppose you have a big shift of demand from the away from automobiles onto lumber. So then Western United States and Western Canada have a boom, and Eastern United States and Eastern Canada have a kind of recession. There's no way in which an exchange rate change is going to solve that problem, because the exchange rate change is along the north-south boundary. If Canada, which is probably more to the case, the superpower in Canada, in the Canadian economy, is of course Ontario. It's like Ontario is to Canada more or less what the United States is to the world. The superpowers. So if the Bank of Canada looks at the inflation rate in Ontario and guides that, and it sees that there's a shift of demand that's creating inflation in the West and deflationary pressure in the East, the Bank of Canada will start to expand the money supply in order to keep the equilibrium in Ontario, but it'll aggravate the inflation in British Columbia. Or on the other side, if it was a shift of demand the other direction, the Bank of Canada would tighten up for Ontario, while it would aggravate the recession in the western parts of the region. So that was the basic idea of the concept of flexible exchange rates. What the conclusion of that was that on these grounds, flexible exchange rates will only work if currencies coincide with regions, the regional concept of the world. Now, economics has had a long history of defining a region as a zone within which factors of production are mobile, but between which they're not mobile. Ricardo set this pattern back in the 1817. So if you have multi-regional countries, if you have a place like, you might decide that on pure arguments for flexible exchange rates, Canada is not one region. Canada's maybe 5 regions, or maybe even 10. So you really, by that argument, have to have, in order to use flexible exchange rates, to do the jobs that the proponents of it were saying should be done, you'd have to have, British Columbia should have a separate currency, Quebec a separate currency, the Maritimes, Atlantic provinces a separate currency, Ontario a separate currency, and so on. So you have to split up the country in that way. Now the problem is that when you start to split up national economies, you run smack into a big political issue, that namely the government, but the currencies are also partly an expression. All money is partly political. You can't talk about money without being political. So that creates a major problem. But in theory, the only case where you would have an argument for a global system of which you'd have to say not flexible exchange rates, but a system where each country tries to solve its own inflation problem on its own by inflation targeting or monetary targeting, letting the exchange rate go there where they were. The only case where that would work, in theory, would be if all countries were region, or if all currencies were based on a regional pattern of behavior, not upon the national patterns. And you look around the world and you see that a flexible exchange rates is not going to do the job there. And now you have, of course, you have countries like in Canada. Canada had a very strong defense of flexible exchange rates and big opposition to fixed exchange rates in the 1990 annual report of the Bank of Canada. And this was had many good things in it. It had also, I think, a lot of mistakes in it. And I wrote a paper at that time. I was in Canada. I was teaching at McGill that year, and called "On the Overvaluation of the Canadian Dollar" at that time. And I was attacking the report, picking holes in the report of the Bank of Canada, which had a very productive effect. It got me an invitation to dinner at the Bank of Canada, and we talked about it there, and we sort of, said they decided, well, yes, they'd made some mistakes in it, but they still would keep to the basic idea. But now here's the issue, of course, is let's look at practically. Let's look at so we don't talk about Canada. Canada's more difficult in many ways than some other countries. But let's look at the third country in North America, Mexico. Now, Mexico, as I say, had this long period, 22 years, of fixed exchange rates. But by 1976, two things happened. One was that Mexico learned that they were all sitting on one of the great reservoirs of oil in the world. The oil boom in Mexico was just starting to spike, becoming a very rich country suddenly, much richer country than before. And that was one thing. And the other thing was the IMF had just adopted this Second Amendment saying that countries should go on flexible exchange rates. And managed flexible exchange rates, it was called. So they sent somebody down to Mexico, head of the department, and pushed Mexico into floating. And they gave up that peg that they'd kept for 22 years. And for 22 years, the Mexican, the dollar was 8 cents. And then, the Mexican peso was 8 cents. The dollar was 12 and a half pesos in those 22 years. They devalued the dollar under the IMF urging, so it was worth not 8 cents, but 5 cents. And you could make some case that in the short run, that had some merit to it. But the problem was that Mexico gave up then their system of monetary stability. The fixed exchange rate was a monetary rule that kept Mexico stable. After the devaluation, Mexico gave up, didn't have a monetary rule. They didn't keep to a new exchange rate. They didn't have a monetary rule. And they moved into hyperinflation. For the next 20 years, 15 years, Mexico was a basket case. Even though this country had just discovered oil, one of the big, richest reservoirs of oil, certainly in the Western Hemisphere, it was having the inflation of a very poor country. And they lost the direction of investment. And what happened? You really just remember your history. 1976, already by 1982, the pit of the debt crisis was in Mexico. The opening of the global debt crisis was in 1982 in Mexico. In Mexico, this country that just had all these new resources were uncovered, and a lot of capital coming in to help Mexico develop these resources suddenly became a basket case. And they took them a long time to get back. Under the government of Miguel de Madrid, they finally started to work painfully back into the fold to solve the debt crisis, and then they got the inflation rate down. But they had to get the inflation, to get back the price level to normal. They'd had so much inflation, they took 3 zeros off the level. Instead of having 3,500 pesos to the dollar, they lopped off 3 zeros and had only 3.5 pesos to the dollar. And that was where the exchange rate was in 1994, 93, 94, when, 94 was a bad year for Mexico. It was an election year. The Salinas government had which had been in power, was on its way out in Mexico. He had one term in office, one 6-year term in office. So the Salinas government was on its way out, and they knew, and Mexico has a one-party system, had since the 1929, I guess it is, a one-party system, the PRI. But they still pretend it's a kind of election. They are elected, but it's only one party in power there. The trouble is the head of that party, named Colosio, was assassinated, and then they replaced him with an unlikely choice, a PhD in economics of all things, from Yale University, Zedillo. And anyway, he, over this period, campaigned for it. And then, in the meantime, Mexico was getting into a big crisis. They got into a big crisis, and they started to sterilize. They didn't obey the adjustment mechanism. And then they had a devaluation. And just think for a moment of how badly policies like this are managed. The dollar was 3.5 pesos. And some people thought it was the peso was overvalued, and they should raise the price of the dollar, have a 20% devaluation, something like that, to make Mexico more competitive. Some people argue that that wasn't the case. There was no need for it. But let's, for the moment, let's say that it was overvalued. And if anyone went around and said that it was overvalued, you'd ask them how much. And they'd say 20%, 30%, 40%, something like that. But whatever the case, they would never say 100% or 200%. If Mexico, if it had been overvalued, they could have devalued from 3.5 to 4 or 4.2 to the dollar. And that would have been as much as anyone would have wanted. If you wanted to have some extra leeway, you could say 4.5 to the dollar. And then that devaluation would have taken care of and brought things back to equilibrium again. But the way it turned out, under flexible exchange rates, is that the peso is now, today, it's 9 or 10 to the dollar. So you had all that built-up excess inflation from 1994 until the present. Mexico earned, with very hard work, their monetary stability in the early 1990s, and then with the crisis under the IMF supervision, it was thrown out the window, and they lost their monetary stability. Now Mexico is trying to get back to monetary stability, and they have the man in charge of the central bank now, Guillermo Ortiz, who is a PhD also from Stanford University, but he was the culprit, or he was the Minister of Finance during the fiasco of the Great Confusion of 1995, 94 and 95. And then he's head of the central bank, and he's a very persuasive man, and he's very intelligent and a friend of mine and all that. But the problem there now is the inflation rate was 10% last year, and now they're getting it down to 6%, 7%, 6%, 5%, and they're hoping to get it down to 4%. They're using inflation targeting to get it down. In theory, it sounds good. And at the 75th anniversary of the founding of the Bank of Mexico in November last year, the heads of the central banks, including Greenspan, Eddie George of England, and Trichet from France, all came down and they said, "Oh, you're doing a great job. Keep up the good work of getting the inflation rate down." But what it always happens is that in getting the inflation rate down, it always works through one particular mechanism under inflation targeting. It always works through appreciating the currency. Think what happened. You have, let's say the inflation rate is 10%. You decide now you want to not keep the inflation rate where it is. That's pretty easy. But you want to get the inflation rate down to 5%. You have to raise interest rates. That attracts capital, and that creates a current account deficit. But that capital inflow appreciates the currency. And that is the bite, by overvaluing the currency, you put pressure on domestic prices in order to get them down. And so at the end of the process, you have to, you can get the inflation rate down, and Mexico will be successful in it, but the end point will be an overvalued currency. Because the way you've got the inflation rate down is by this appreciation of the currency. So that's not a steady state equilibrium. First of all, there's a big current account deficit, and second, the exchange rate is grossly overvalued. So you can devalue the exchange rate then at that point without causing inflation, because when the currency is overvalued, you can change the valuation of it without causing inflation. But you can't have a devaluation in a flexible exchange rate system. And the current fix of policy today among central bankers is that you shouldn't intervene in the foreign exchange market. Don't intervene in the foreign exchange market. That's anathema. That's not. You shouldn't do that. And if you don't do that, then what will happen in Mexico, and it's almost clear, is there's an overvalued peso, and eventually, at some point, the market will sense that it's overvalued, and there'll be a big crisis. And then at that point, Mexico will have to go back and do they'll have to decide, are they going to repeat the fiasco of 1994 and 95, or are they going to try something different? What I've told President Fox, I've met him at least 5 times, and I've had dinner with him and talked with him about this, is that we had dinner with Ortiz in there. Ortiz was saying, no, this system is going to work fine. I was saying, no, it's going to lead to a crisis. So I said, well, that's not a bad idea. Follow Guillermo's advice as it is, and if he's right, then fine, that's good. Then I'll have egg on my face. But if it turns out there is a crisis, then you have to do what I say to correct it, which is to have a quick devaluation and then fix it with a kind of automatic mechanism of adjustment, currency board system or otherwise. And that's what I think Mexico should do, and I think ultimately that will do. Now, I could, when I tell you that scenario, some of you who may be historians a little bit of Canada may see some similarities. Do you remember what happened in the 1980s? You remember the inflation rate in Canada? The Canadian dollar was very low, very low. The American, the U.S. value of the Canadian dollar was 73 cents, something like that, very low around 1987. And the Canadian inflation rate was high, and so was the unemployment rate high. At that time, a new man from England became the governor of the Bank of Canada, John Crow. And he announced a policy of zero inflation, of getting inflation down to zero. So inflation was around 6 or 7%. He wanted to bring it down to zero. I won't go into all the difficulties involved in that when the United States had an inflation rate of 4% and getting it down to zero. But in the attempt to implement that policy, interest rates were raised. The American interest rates at this time were 8%, and the Canadian interest rates went up to 15%. And capital moved to Canada, and the Canadian dollar moved way up. It went up to 91 cents. Maybe it went to 92. I don't know. It was high, from 73 cents to 90 cents in the period of 3 or 4 years. Tremendous appreciation. It did enormous damage to Canadian industry. It raised unemployment and almost created, it hurt Quebec in a very different way than it hurt Ontario and the outlying provinces. Almost created a kind of separation of Canada. But notice what happened to the exchange rate. This policy was successful in getting inflation rate down, not to zero, but to 2%, which is pretty good when the United States had 4%. They got it down lower, 3%. They got it down a little lower than the American inflation rate. But the dollar was 90-some cents, 92 cents. Very quickly, the market sensed this overvaluation, huge current account deficit in the United States and in Canada. And very quickly, there was a turnaround, and the currency came right back down to where it was, 73 cents. And then it even went below that, 73 cents. As a result of that policy, it was a fiasco because unemployment rate was for a long period 2-digit levels in Canada, over 10% in Canada, at a time when historically the American and Canadian unemployment rates have more or less been the same. But over this period, there was at least an excess of about 4% unemployment rate in Canada. Well, what was the ultimate result of it? Well, as I said, the currency, the dollar, Canadian dollar, came way back down again. But the political impact was that the Conservative Party, which had this strong majority in the 1980s, was reduced to two seats. course, a lot of people say, "Good riddance." They didn't like the government. Those who didn't like the government because of the goods and services tax, or because of the free trade area, and this problem of the unemployment, the public and even the government blamed the free trade area. The people were blaming the free trade area for the unemployment, but it wasn't that; it was the monetary policy. So, there's never been an acknowledgement of the big mistake of that in Canada. But it's not just there, but in every time you see this disinflation, dynamic inflation targeting, where you're not trying to keep the inflation rate stable, but you're trying to move it down, it always works by overvaluing the currency, and it's always followed by the need for a devaluation. This is a bad situation, and it just means that it's not a very good way to operate. Well, so the bottom line is that Canada and Mexico, certainly Mexico, and maybe Canada too, and would be better off having a policy, a monetary policy, that was the same as the American monetary policy. And the way to do that would be through some of the different devices that are possible to make Canada or Mexico more like California in the system. We could wish, with the higher income levels. But that would be one way of doing it. But how would you go about doing that? Suppose that we want to create a North American currency area. By the way, a currency area is any zone of fixed exchange rates. Exchange rates are fixed in a currency area. That's optimum currency area is the optimum area of the zone of fixed exchange rates. So how would you do that? Well, one proposal is dollarization. Just use the American dollar inside Canada, like Ecuador is doing. But by the way, I'm not a strong proponent of it for Ecuador, but they're doing it, and I hope it's a success. But I'm not a strong proponent of it for it. Dollarization. Now that has the cost of seigniorage, because it means that somehow or other you have to buy the American dollars enough to replace the Canadian dollars, and that takes real resources for it. You could borrow them, or you could, but you can't print them, because the Canadians can print Canadian dollars, but they can't print American dollars without getting into trouble with the United States. So the dollarization has a cost, seigniorage, and it also, of course, like all these, any kind of fixed exchange rate area, any kind of fixed exchange rate, making North America a common fixed exchange rate area, a currency area of any kind, optimal or not, is going to give all of North America more or less the same inflation rate. But then the issue of leadership comes in. Who determines what that inflation rate is going to be? Let's suppose for a moment that North America was all dollarized, Mexico and Canada, along with the United States. Well, it would be, America would determine it, because they're the ones that determine how many American dollars are produced. So the Americans would completely dominate that currency area. And you could make a case, you could make a strong case. Well, what's wrong with that? What's wrong with having them dominate it? And will they be good or worse, better or worse monetary leaders than the Bank of Mexico or the Bank of Canada? Well, historically, at least in the past 70 years, the America's had a better inflation record than Canada has, and much better inflation record than Mexico had. Mexico had a little better inflation record in the 19th century because Mexico didn't have a civil war, and Mexico in the 1930s didn't have a Great Depression to the same extent because they were on the silver standard, and silver didn't appreciate in the same way. But since the 1970s, Mexico has had an atrocious long-run inflation record. So by choosing the dollar, they'd get a better monetary policy than before. Canada, since the 1970s, would get a very different monetary policy had they been linked to the dollar, either by dollarization or a fixed exchange rate area. In 1974, I think it was, the Canadian dollar reached a high point against the American dollar of 107, a 7% premium. John Turner was the Minister of Finance in this period, so it was a 7% premium over it. Now the Canadian dollar is 62 or 3 cents. Okay, so there's a big drop down, and all that would not have happened had Canada had a fixed exchange rate or used the dollar. Now, nobody likes the low Canadian dollar, but someone could surely say, well, what if we didn't have this low Canadian dollar, if we'd kept the dollar up at $1, parity with the United States, let's say, if we'd kept it up there, would we have paid for that in some other way? Would we have paid for that by deflation? Well, that would be an issue that you'd have to look at, but clearly you can't go around saying you don't want to have a low Canadian dollar, because nobody would, other things equal, want that. But you can't say you'd like to have a low Canadian, you'd like to have a high Canadian dollar without also some price adjustments that would make those Canadian dollars effective. So that would be the argument you can get. Well, of the ways of getting the same monetary policy, you have fixed exchange rates, just fixing the exchange rate to the American dollar. The Bank of Canada can do that, and if they don't know how to do that, they can learn very quickly in about 10 or 15 minutes how to do it. Austria did it to Germany for 25 years in the post-war period. It wasn't a currency board system. Austrian kept their shillings fixed to the Deutsche Mark for 20 years, and they had no difficulty doing that. The European countries had no difficulties doing that. Japan kept its yen fixed to the US dollar in the great period of their sudden economic rise between 1955 and 1970, when the Japanese economy was growing on an average of something like 12% a year for 15 years. The largest, biggest expansion record for any economy. Mexico, well, so I've said the fixed exchange rate, a la Austria and Germany, or a lot of other countries, or all countries, except for Canada, in the post-war period, the 1950s and 60s, when all currencies were fixed to the US dollar. And that was there was no difficulty with that system. That gave the system high growth and low inflation rate. That was good. Dollarization, which is giving up the Canadian dollar, and it's a bigger step, a much bigger step, because there's the emotional attachment to the loonie, and you wouldn't have you'd be using a currency that has a picture of Benjamin Franklin on it instead of Queen Elizabeth. So there's that, and then there's the seigniorage issue. Now, I myself don't think that the seigniorage issue is the real meaning, because the cost of bad monetary policy is always several times larger than seigniorage. If you could argue, if you could prove that it was going to be a good monetary policy, it would be worth sacrificing the seigniorage to it. A fourth method would be to have a monetary union, the way Europe did, the way Europe has done. To have a monetary union, you have to do 5 things. You have to, by the way, you can have a monetary union without a single currency. You could have a monetary union between the United States and Canada and Mexico while retaining these currencies. But here's what there's a model for that. The model for that is Europe up until the beginning of this year. From 1999 to this period, they had a fixed exchange rate system, locked exchange rates, but they didn't have a single currency. Now they're moving in this phase to the single currency. But you had a fixed exchange rate system. You had a monetary union with, in this case, a 12-currency monetary union in Europe. Here's what you have to do. You have to have agreement on a common inflation rate. If you don't have a common agreement on inflation targeting, then don't even get to question 2, because you have to share an inflation rate. You have to find a mechanism for determining what that inflation rate is going to be. Europe decided they did it through consensus. They chose 0 to 2% for their target inflation rate. The second, you need to have the same index of inflation. You have to measure inflation in the same way. You can't have France with weights in the French basket and Italian weights in the Italian basket and expect to get the same inflation rate. You have to have common weights to it. Europe did solve that problem with Eurostat. Then you have to lock exchange rates in different ways of doing that. And you then have to have a common monetary policy, because there's only one monetary policy for the area as a whole. And then the fifth thing is you have to have or should have a means for distributing seigniorage in it. Now, Herbert Grubel, former MP and also professor at Simon Fraser University, and now a research fellow at the Fraser Institute, has proposed an amero for the United States, Canada, and Mexico. And this would mean that each of the countries would give up their currencies in exchange for an amero. It would be a single currency monetary union, modeled more or less the way Europe is doing now after this period, scrapping their own currencies. In looking at these different alternatives, I'm not an enthusiast for the single currency monetary union that would be different from the US dollar. Because the United States dollar does not just belong to North America or even the United States, it belongs to the whole world. It's the most important currency of the 20th century. It'll be the most important currency for a long time to come still in this century, although the euro is going to become a rival to the dollar, but it'll take some time before that develops. But if the United States gave up, scrapped this currency, you're asking it to give up, well, first of all, the Americans would never do it. They would never do it to please Canadians or Mexicans. They would say, get lost. They wouldn't do it because it's like this would end up being any one way or the other a dominated monetary union. It would be dominated in the same way that if Mercosur, the 4 countries in South America that have been contemplating a monetary union, would be dominated by Brazil with a kind of a little bit by Argentina too, but Brazil with 170, 180 million people would dominate that union. There's no question that the United States would dominate this. Well, is North America an optimum currency area. Leaving aside those arguments for flexible exchange rates, which I think is not a good argument for keeping the Canadian dollar in this way, I'm not sure that North America is the right unit for it. It's not a political unit. It's not a political area in the same way that Europe is becoming a political area. There's a relationship between currency areas and power centers, the distribution of power in the world. And I think you'll find that that now Europe was able to go ahead with its common currency because no single country in Europe dominated. Even though Germany was the strongest economy, France and Italy could gang up together against Germany and outvote them or out-persuade them. So, and with Britain in it, it was not dominated, but this would be a dominated unit. So if Canadians didn't like that domination, and Mexicans didn't like the gringo currency to rule, and remember Mexico has a history of being invaded or invading the United States, and a tense relationship that comes up again. It's not necessarily the right approach. Well, here I've been talking about local issues in a way, but there's also the global issue, because to me I think the issue of not the issue, the technical issue of is North America an optimum currency area, but the different sort of issue, the practical policy issue of should North America form itself into a currency area in one of these different alternatives that it has. Should it do that? I think that has to be talked about in the context of the world economy. We've now got, in the world economy, three very large currency areas. The dollar area, the euro area, and the yen area. The importance of currency areas is measured by monetary mass. And monetary mass is more or less proportionate to GDP. The GDP of the United States is pushing $11 trillion. The GDP of the euro area is $6 trillion. The GDP of Japan is $4 trillion. And those are by far the biggest currency areas. The next one is the pound sterling, which is $1.5 trillion. And then you go down to China and Russia, $1.1 trillion. Now, China's currency is fixed to the US dollar. So this is a very important thing. And Hong Kong's currency is fixed to the US dollar. And Malaysia's currency is fixed to the US dollar. And so is the currencies of the Gulf states are fixed to the US dollar. And so is Panama and Ecuador's and so on. So the dollar area is actually larger than it appears to be. It would have a GDP of more like not 11 but 12 billion dollars. But the big problem in this area is Japan, because the yen, it's been the fluctuations of the yen. The fluctuations of the yen over the past 25 years have been the big sob story of the last quarter century. It's been devastating for Japan to have flexible exchange rates. And they've paid for it doubly. They paid for it after the Plaza Accord, when, well, you think what happened. The Plaza, at the time of the Plaza Accord in 1985, the dollar was 250 yen. 10 years later, in April 1995, the dollar was 78 yen. So it had gone down in 10 years from 250 yen to 78 yen. It had fallen, the dollar had fallen to 1/3. The yen had tripled, appreciated, tripled. What did that do to the assets in Japan. It ruined the assets of companies, and it ruined the assets of banking system. And Japan is going to be paying for trying to unscramble their banking problems for quite a long time to come because of that idiotic over-appreciation of the yen that really did a lot of harm. And then after that, though, there was a depreciation of the yen. From 1995 to June 1998, the dollar soared to 148 yen. And that is what caused the Asian crisis. That caused the Asian crisis. It wasn't crony capitalism in Asia. People, but that's nonsense. It wasn't crony capitalism. There's always been crony capitalism in Asia, and there always probably will be. It's crony capitalism in the United States. You see Enron and Anderson, and this is crony capitalism. Much of capitalism obeys crony rules. But how that worked out, I don't want to spend more time on that, but it worked out because when the dollar soared and the yen depreciated, this made these Southeast Asian economies much less competitive. And at the same time, it shut off Japanese foreign investment in those countries because their currencies became overvalued, and Japan always invests in countries after a devaluation, and not the opposite. So that was the engine of growth in Southeast Asia, and that was cut off. And those countries in all the countries that had suffered from the Asian crisis, like Thailand, Malaysia, Indonesia, and South Korea, all had the same problems about weak macroeconomic policy, whereas all the countries that survived the Asian crisis, and that includes Singapore, Hong Kong, I'm calling it a country, it's not exactly a country, China, Taiwan, and Japan, they escaped scot-free. They escaped scot-free because they had low debts, they had very large foreign exchange reserves, and didn't have to draw on the IMF, and each one had a very clear-cut, explicit target for their monetary policy. So that's, but now, to get back to the big issue, you have now this zone. Does Asia need a common currency? Forget North America. It's difficult for North America, but does Asia need one? Most Asians think that, yes, we do need a common currency. Now, it can't be a single currency because you don't have the political development in Asia for a single currency. But you could have a fixed exchange rate monetary union, keeping national currencies. You've already got kind of beginnings of monetary union with China and Hong Kong and Malaysia, again with the United States. The missing link here is Japan. If Japan were able to fix the yen against the dollar, you'd suddenly have a big change in the way the Pacific works. You'd see suddenly the rest of Asia would want to fix onto this group, and you'd have a very large currency area in Asia, counting the United States. So what it really amounts to is that if you have this strategy of forming a big currency area in the Pacific region, the way to do it would be a wider area, like APEC, the APEC, the group that includes not China, Japan, Korea, Australia, New Zealand, Indonesia, Singapore, Malaysia, Thailand, and Russia, and Canada, and the United States, and Mexico, and Chile, and Peru. And that area comprises a GDP total of something like $22 trillion, over half global GDP. And all it would take to get it would be for the Japanese to fix the yen to the dollar and get back to the policy mix that they were so successful in exploiting in their great period of growth in the 1950s and 1960s. Well, I'm going to Japan next week, and I'm certainly going to be pushing that line. And I in the last week or 2 weeks ago, I was in China, and I had about an hour talk with the Premier of China, Premier Zhu Rongyi, about just this issue. And the Chinese were worried that Japan's policy is going to get the dollar up to 150, 160 yen, and then China might feel it has to devalue, and it would create tremendous confusion in all of Asia. So that's one strategy, because you're going to find that the optimum currency area, that I'm saying that the optimum currency area is not North America, it's the world. But to get to the world, we have to take the Asian Pacific part of the world first, and then next we work on the Atlantic part of the world and get the dollar and the euro tied together, because the fluctuations of the dollar-euro have been very bad news for Europe, and I think they've been bad news for the United States. I think it's been a very bad idea, short-sighted policy on the part of the United States to let the euro go down and the dollar stay so strong at a time when there's a global slowdown, and when the U.S. has a huge whopping current account deficit of $450 billion, going up to $600 billion, 6% of GDP, at a time very different from the 1980s, when the United States was a net creditor in the world economy. Now the United States is a net debtor. Its debt, net indebtedness, is 25% of GDP. And next year, it'll be 30%. And the year after, it might be 35%. Very quickly, you're getting up to crisis periods where this, so it's a mistake, and I think the way to handle the North American, the Atlantic area is for the United States to put a floor to the euro, and at, I would say, 85 cents to start with, and for Europe to put a floor to the dollar at 115, and then gradually see what exchange rates can be worked out comfortably to find a period at which stabilization would be better. And then after that period, you've got the exchange rates down to moving not so much anymore, not necessarily completely fixed, but then that area, that large currency area, will form the platform on which you could build a global currency. And I think a global currency and a recreation of a global unit of account is the way in which we should go. I just conclude with a comment that Paul Volcker has repeated over and over again, that a global economy requires a global currency. And that I think that Canada should work toward that process, and that's a better bet for Canada than to work for the North American Union in isolation. Thank you.
On behalf of Carleton, I want to thank you, Professor Mundell, for your address this afternoon. And I invite you to join us. There will be a reception just across the hall behind us here.